right, I want to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Chapter meeting. My name is Diana Wynand. I'm the chapter chair, and we have a terrific program for you tonight. We always like to kick off our meetings with a land acknowledgement, and our programming committee coordinator, Terry Saucier, will be giving our land acknowledgement tonight. Terry?
Yes, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. It acknowledges the history that has brought us to reside on this land, the colonialism that's present in our current systems, and calls on us to be mindful of our own present participation in it. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Tongva, the Quiche, the Tataviam, and the Chumash tribes.
Thank you, Terry. Wow, and that is perfect timing because I just saw that Secretary Crowfoot just joined us. Hello, Secretary Crowfoot. I see that
Hey
you
there.
joined us. I'm going to spotlight you so that everybody can see you. Hi.
Great. Thanks so much. It's actually I'm coming to you from a fairly special day in Sacramento, which is the governor has just given his State of the State speech. And the State of the State typically gets scheduled with about 7 to 10 days notice. And so, of course, we had our conversation planned a long time ago, and the governor just concluded his State of the State speech. And I'm actually, believe it or not, I found a quiet place in the governor's mansion to come spend a little time with you. So I can definitely update you on the most recent news from Sacramento.
We are so honored that you made this happen tonight and that you honored our appointment to be here with us. So thank you very much. And perfect. That was exactly what we wanted to start with. We do have an introduction. So just to give a little bit of background on you, if you don't mind. So I'm going to just turn to Michelle Ringler, our brand new vice chair. So Michelle, can you just give us a little bit of an overview of the secretary, if you would?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Well, the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Project is thrilled and honored to have Secretary Wade Crowfoot speak to us about the California 30 by 30 initiative and other important topics. Wade Crowfoot became California's Natural Resources Secretary in January 2019, appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom. Secretary Crowfoot oversees an agency of 21,000 employees who protect and manage California's natural environment. This includes stewarding the state's forests and natural lands, rivers and waterways, and coast and ocean, protecting fish and wildlife, and overseeing energy development. As a member of the governor's cabinet, he advises Governor Newsom on natural resources and environmental issues. Secretary Crowfoot firmly believes that good natural resources management helps natural places thrive and allows communities and our economy to prosper. We have common interests in that Secretary Crowfoot's key priorities include building California's resilience to climate change-driven threats, including wildfire, drought, extreme heat, flooding, and sea level rise, expanding equitable access to parks, natural places, and outdoor recreation for all Californians, and preserving California's world-renowned biodiversity of plants and animals. And we're especially excited to hear from him tonight. And with that, let's give a warm welcome to Secretary Wade Crowfoot.
Yay, thank you, thank you. Thanks, Michelle. You were starting to tell us about the governor and the State of the State speech, and I'm curious if there's anything that he said. He was really hitting some climate action hard, and thought that was great. Anything that impacts you in your agency?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here, and I really wanted to be with you tonight and to, as you said, honor the commitment, because you guys are on the ground, making the work happen and holding us accountable, holding your elected officials accountable, really trying to drive climate progress, and that's what we need now more than ever. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that means for the work that I do in our agency. And most of our time, I'm hoping that we can just have a discussion. And once I lay out what we're trying to do, hear about, opportunities where you all are at in the San Fernando Valley and greater LA to do this work. And to me, I was just actually in the North Bay of the San Francisco Bay in Marin and Sonoma counties last night in a community dialogue. And I really I draw a lot of energy and insight from hearing from you guys. So in any event, the state of the state is obviously the opportunity. It's like the State of the Union, but for California, and it's the opportunity for the governor to lay out, his vision for the year. I think he gave a very short speech this year because there's obviously so much happening in the world.
I'm sorry,
and
I'm slow, David.
All right, I just
we gave a big budget presentation last month, including really laying out our climate agenda. And so it was a short and focused speech. But one thing he said, which is germane to, I'm sure, what we all care about right now, is just addressing the
Dave, I have this.
addressing the war in Ukraine, and of course the invasion, and really using that as an opportunity to underscore our need to rid ourselves of this addiction of fossil fuels and to move beyond fossil fuels for so many reasons. First and foremost, climate change, but also to reduce our dependence on what he called petro dictators today, but certainly includes the Putin regime in Russia. So that's top of mind. This has been a really challenging last few years in California and the world when we've realized the full extent of accelerating climate change. In other words, what we thought would be the impacts of climate change evolving over decades is already here. Mm-hmm. It's remarkable to think about, but California has funded a bunch of scientific assessments of climate change, and specifically focused on how does all this planetary climate science, how can that be downscaled in California, and understanding what the impacts will be here. Well, just about 5 years ago, there was the fourth scientific climate assessment, and scientists were projecting the impacts of climate change. And candidly, they projected impacts from wildfire and drought and extreme heat for the end of the century. And in the last few years, we've actually experienced those impacts already. In other words, 80 years prior to their projections, we're experiencing those impacts. And this, whether that's what's evolving as the season of smoke, or the extreme heat that you all are experiencing in Southern California, mm-hmm. or certainly the drought conditions that we're working a lot to respond to. And then, never too far from our minds is flooding and sea level rise. So we have this major challenge in California around how to protect people and nature from climate change, while demonstrating for the rest of the world how we're going to transition off fossil fuels, maintain our economic prosperity, improve our equity, and essentially move to a carbon neutral or carbon free future. So we're hard at work at that in Sacramento. Between the governor and the legislature, the vision is to spend about $37 billion here in coming years on this transition. That's everything from making it far easier to drive a zero emission vehicle than you can right now, really investing more in our pedestrian, bike, public transit networks to help people get around without cars, deepen energy efficiency in homes, really decarbonize homes by getting natural gas out of homes, expand radically our renewable energy to 100% clean energy. Mm-hmm. And that's all great stuff. And our agency actually works on that. We have an entity called the California Energy Commission that's driving a lot of that investment. But one thing that's missing, and that I'll really focus on really for I think the rest of my time where I provide the introduction here, is nature. It's remarkable. California has this iconic nature. People from around the world come to our, experience our nature, whether that's the Southern California beaches or Yosemite or Big Sur. But what's interesting is that our nature, while we've done a pretty good job in California conserving it, was never really envisioned or considered as a climate solution. And we're working to change that here in California. And that's really through lifting up what we call nature-based solutions to climate change. Mm-hmm. So how can nature help us solve the climate crisis? Well, one is really what we call climate mitigation, or essentially achieving that carbon neutrality. And that is by improving our management of our natural and working lands. So think everything from forests to the Chaparral Mountains of Southern California, to farms, to even urban spaces, to maximize the amount of the potential of our soils, our trees, to remove carbon from the atmosphere, which we call carbon sequestration, and store that carbon. The Earth is a remarkable sink for carbon if it's allowed to be. So there's both the maximizing carbon sequestration, but then there's also utilizing nature to be a buffer from these climate impacts that I mentioned. Either that's well-managed landscapes that reduce catastrophic fire risks that bear down on our communities, or seasonal coastal wetlands in California that can help absorb sea level rise and that storm surge that's exacerbated by sea level rise, or urban greening, where we put urban canopy trees in the urban environment to reduce temperatures, but also create more opportunities for capturing stormwater and recharging our basins. So we're huge on nature-based solutions in our agency. And really thankful to Governor Newsom for 2 years ago issuing an executive order to really lift up nature-based solutions as a key sort of piece of our puzzle on addressing climate change. And so since then, we've been really hard at work on establishing some important strategies. One is called the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, but the other is called 30 by 30. And 30 by 30 is a galvanizing campaign that's actually happening around the world. Countries around the world that are part of this group called the high ambition countries have committed to protecting 30% of their land by 2030 in just 8 years' time. Recognizing that protecting land and conserving that land is really critical to absorbing carbon that we know is being emitted into the atmosphere and strengthening our climate resilience from these impacts across the world. So a few years ago, Governor Newsom caught wind of this, and we talked a lot, and he said, why can't California do this? Why can't we be the first place in the United States to do this? And so he set this executive order and established this target. And it was actually about 4 to 5 months later that the Biden-Harris administration set a very similar target of 30 by 30 across the country. So we've been really hard at work since then, making, sort of breathing life into that target. And as you know, the way a target is defined really impacts its consequence or its importance. In other words, if it's defined, the 30% conserved land defined overly broadly, some argue that we've already achieved 30% conservation of protected land. But we took a fairly ambitious definition of conserved land, and it's based on the US Geological Survey, an analysis of protected lands across the country. And if you look at that definition, that's what we built into our draft 30 by 30 plan that we put out. It demonstrates that we've conserved about 24% of our state. We're just over 100 million acres. So that means we have to conserve over 6 million acres of additional land by 2030. And what does that look like in an area like the San Fernando Valley or greater Los Angeles? From our perspective, it means that more lands are protected either because they're acquired by county parks or local parks or state parks or public agencies for public use, so acquisitions, conservation easements that ensure that a land will be conserved in perpetuity according to certain environmental criteria. It's also improving conservation designations. You obviously have a lot of national forests up in the San Gabriel Mountains, and Senator Padilla and Congressman Schiff and others are working to actually better protect those national forest lands by making them national monuments, which is a stronger protective status, or similar designations to improve conservation. So I'm really, really energized. We've got a draft 30 by 30 plan that took about a year to generate. We were informed in that drafting by regional meetings that we did across the state. We call them regional workshops. Unfortunately, because of COVID, they had to be held virtually, but we did, I think 9 or 10 regional meetings, including in Southern California. We also did a bunch of topical panels on things like equity, on incorporating tribal partnerships and tribal knowledge, expanding equitable access to our open spaces. And what resulted is this draft strategy that we then received or requested and received public comment. Over 1,100 unique points of input. In other words, not just, postcards that are signed by certain organizations, but 1,100 organizations or people actually provided specific feedback on our 30 by 30 plan. And so now we are weeks away from finalizing that plan. The governor has proposed an initial investment of $750 million into nature-based solutions and 30 by 30, which is a really big investment, but it's certainly not the total amount that we'll need in the next 8 years. We have legislators, including some of whom are downstairs, really marking this moment with the administration, really excited about 30 by 30. I think including, your Assemblymember Rivas, who is a major environmental leader up here and chairs the Natural Resources Committee, and a lot of Los Angeles area leaders excited about 30 by 30. So I'm really excited about that. We've got a lot of other initiatives going, which I'm glad to talk about. One of which is what we call cutting the green tape, which is trying to reduce the bureaucracy that slows down environmental restoration projects. We're really excited about that. We've launched an Outdoors for All initiative in California to build access to communities that don't have access to the outdoors and recreation. And so that's obviously complementary to 30 by 30. And so there's so much that we're doing, but I'll stop there, and hopefully that's at least a broad overview of some of the work we're doing that may be of interest to you all.
Absolutely. And when I look at all of the things that you do, it's all stuff we're interested in because it's all about nature. And so one of the questions that we had, and just so everybody knows, Michelle and I are going to ask a few questions just to continue this conversation, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So we will allow everybody to submit a question. But regarding that, I know that 30 by 30 is a big part of what you're going to be doing. How is that balanced with the rest of the work that your agency does? Is it going to be your primary focus? I know you have some terrific people on your team. We met with them yesterday, or is it just going to, is 30 by 30 going to be just a sliver?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, it's a big agency and we have a lot of important responsibilities under us. So I think as your colleague mentioned, we include CAL FIRE. So we're the states, we have within our agency, those folks fighting the catastrophic wildfire crisis, and importantly, building our resilience through proactive upfront actions to reduce catastrophic wildfire risk. And I'm happy to talk about that. That's a huge priority right now for obvious reasons. We also have the Department of Water Resources. And so we are one of the leaders of the state's drought response. And we're now in our second major drought, really, among the worst in the state's history that we're experiencing right now, that frankly, we thought we might be getting out of after that incredible December, but we're locking into a third year of worsening drought. So we have that as well. And then of course we have the Coastal Commission and the Conservancy. So we're on top of sea level rise, as well as just releasing extreme heat strategy. So I would say this, 30 by 30 is a priority. It's certainly not the only priority. I talk about my priorities as threefold, because I feel like in these jobs, you really have to distill your priorities, or you can kind of get spread out and distracted. One is, first and foremost, building our climate resilience, because fundamentally we are the agency that's kind of pointed the spear on that. And the way I define that is protecting people and nature from the impacts of climate change. So that's priority number one. Priority number two is addressing inequity in the state. And specifically, we do that by building equitable access to our outdoors. We're also steward cultural and historic resources in the state. So really building access to natural, historical, cultural resources, and ensure everybody's story is told in our state parks and in all that we steward. And then thirdly is protecting biodiversity. Remarkably few people know that California is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. And don't take it from me. This is scientists around the world have identified certain places in the world with tremendous richness of life, but that life is under significant stress. And California is one of those places. 40% of this country's species, plants and animals, et cetera, live in California. And the majority of those only live in California. So we have remarkable biodiversity. And we've done a really good job preventing extinctions through the Endangered Species Act, which is both a federal and a state law. But we need to do a much better job protecting our biodiversity or preserving our biodiversity. And if you think about, the Endangered Species Act, it's a little bit like if you had a healthcare policy that only provided emergency room medicine. In other words, patients that were on the brink of dying. Yeah, of course you're going to do that, but you wouldn't call that an effective healthcare policy. So one of the reasons for 30 by 30, not only is all about climate stuff I talked about, but also to preserve our biodiversity. So those are really three primary priorities: climate resilience, equitable access, and preserving biodiversity. 30 by 30 is going to be a really good galvanizing campaign to address all of those goals. In sort of nature-based and conservation work, we rarely have these easily understandable numeric targets like we do sometimes in renewable energy. So we think 30 by 30 is galvanizing, that we're going to be able to hold ourselves accountable for this level of conservation, which again has climate benefits, equity benefits, and biodiversity benefits.
Regarding 30 by 30, this is a global plan, right? Other countries are involved. Is California, integrating with any other countries around this, or are we in touch with
It's
them?
a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. And so, as you know, there's this international effort, an internationally organized effort through the United Nations to address climate change. And this, if you think about the Paris Accord, or before that, the Rio Earth Summit and Copenhagen, et cetera, the Kyoto protocols, that's all this UN process to try to bring the world together to get our climate change crisis under control. Interestingly, there's also a UN Convention on Biodiversity, basically called the Convention on Biodiversity, and they have their international convenings called Conference of Parties, or COPs. And so California, for the first time, is an official participant in the UN Convention on Biodiversity, where specifically there's this organizing effort of governments around the world that have signed on to 30 by 30. And we're one of the only subnational governments, think like states and provinces, not countries, that are part of this. And Assembly Member Friedman, who represents a part of Greater LA, was really a driving force behind encouraging us to actually become a participant. So we're going to be hopefully in Kunming, China, which is hosting the next Conference of Parties for the Biodiversity Convention, really lifting up 30 by 30, as well as some of our best practices like our marine protected areas, our network of underwater parks, which is really an international model. So like a lot of things in climate change, we're trying to kind of walk the walk in California, but we're trying to spread the gospel in some ways, really demonstrate that what we're doing in California can be done in other parts of the world.
That's very exciting, actually, isn't it? I mean, that what we do right here in our neighborhood could be a model. Michelle has a few questions. We're going to just continue. Just so everybody knows, we spent some time with our legislative committee to create a starter list of questions here. Michelle?
Sure. So, Secretary, you mentioned that you had the regional meetings and you're compiling the data. What are the next steps, and how quickly will those steps be rolled out?
Well, the good news is the next step is to issue a final strategy for 30 by 30. And essentially, it's our roadmap to achieve 30 by 30. We're going to consider it a living document, recognizing that conditions are going to change, opportunities are going to change. And one of the pieces of feedback that we heard is from the draft was we got a lot of validation on the way that we're defining conservation and the broad strategies, but folks said, we want to see more details on implementation. How are you actually going to start implementing this? And what are your plans for like the next 2 years on this? So you're gonna see in that final draft more specific detail on what we're doing, on how we're working to implement this, and frankly, how community-based organizations like the one, that you're part of can actually plug in. We're planning to issue that 30 by 30. We were shooting for May. We might shoot for Earth Day or even earlier. I'm really constructively impatient because, basically now I feel like I'm one of the people responsible for actually achieving this 30 by 30. So I said, I'm like, we have to finish the strategy and we got to be on the move, and we have to get this $750 million. We have to work with our local legislators on what are their priority projects, and we gotta start racking up more conservation.
That's just leads me to the next question, or how are state, federal, local agencies, tribal communities, and nonprofits working together to reach that goal? So you can touch on that a little bit.
I mean, I feel like state government, we kind of have this convening power, but we are not where the work is going to happen. We don't know the best conservation opportunities that exist across the state. And this can't be a top-down, like one-size-fits-all model. What we want to do is essentially empower, regional groups, regional leaders, to identify where there are good opportunities to either acquire land or put land under easement or improve conservation. And then the state would support that, frankly, through funding, through technical assistance, sometimes through policy or law changes. So we're really looking to, regions of the state and local leaders to identify those priorities. So to me, state legislators figure in really directly into that. And so I'm hopeful that the state legislators identify what are their priorities for conservation in their backyard. And already some of the legislators have identified and sent us letters to say, hey, we support 30 by 30. We want these changes in the final draft. And oh, by the way, here are 12 good conservation opportunities in my district. And that's really, really constructive. We are also focused on building capacity of supporting tribal governments and tribal communities to build capacity, but also nonprofits, what we call regional conservation districts, which are across the state conservancies. Because at the end of the day, if we're gonna conserve, over 6 million acres that are not conserved now, it is not going to be through a few government agencies. It's going to be through a ton of different organizations, land trusts as well, out there doing this work and getting these projects done. So from my perspective, if we're successful with the strategy that we'll release by May, you'll be able to see your opportunities for your engagement. And I think working through state legislators on conservation priorities, 30 by 30 priorities, is a great idea because, these folks have great working relationships with your legislators as well as ones across the state to really lift up these projects.
That's terrific. And can you touch on the GIS system, the Geographic Information System, and how that technology will help California achieve its goal?
Yeah, thank you. You're like prompting me to share all the information that I forgot to share. So I appreciate the question. So, part of the challenge with, understanding where we need to do conservation is just the complexity of, what's already conserved across on a map. What are the most, what are the most sensitive habitats that need to be conserved? Where does conserving land allow us to sequester or capture the most carbon? So we partnered with an entity called ESRI, which is based in Redlands. They're basically like one of the preeminent companies in the world on GIS or geospatial information systems. In other words, how do you link data to maps? And so we created California Nature or CA Nature, and we're essentially launching it by Earth Day. And it's going to be essentially an open source, publicly available decision support tool or platform that folks can use to understand where in the state is conserved, where in their backyard is conserved, what are the habitat values of land around them or across the state, what are the carbon sequestration values, where is public access available. The whole idea is it's essentially this platform that's easy to use that has different filters. And the benefit will be that it's going to help our state agencies identify, for example, what are conservation priorities. But if it works effectively, it's going to help entities like those in the San Fernando Valley or greater LA understand like where are the best opportunities, where are the most needs, and where do we want to prioritize. So CA Nature is really, like I said, we're going to launch it with hopefully some media here in the next month. And we'll definitely, share that out. I should mention just if you want to I should, advertise our agency a little bit. If you want to be updated on this type of work, we send out an update about once a month. We don't spam your emails, but we have a listserv. And you could just join at resources.ca.gov. And you'll find out about like when the 30 by 30 strategy is released and when CA Nature is released, et cetera. So we're really looking forward to this data platform being actually useful for folks across the state.
That's fantastic. I know, Diana, you have another question for the Secretary.
Yes, I do. I wanted to bring the 30-30 plan home. I think, as you know, we had an opportunity to present information about the Sepulveda Basin to some of your team, a few members of your team. And that's an example, LA is this urban sprawl, but right in the heart is this 2,000 acres right here in our backyard in San Fernando Valley. It's this gem of nature, or what could be a real gem of the city, if we applied everything that you're talking about in terms of nature-based solutions and the multi-purpose approach and all of that to this particular area. So I just wanted to sort of get a sense of whether or not something like that could be considered as, for the plan, or what would it take to consider something in our backyard as part of the 30 by 30 plan?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Sepulveda Basin is one of these multi-benefit projects, because if I understand it correctly, not only could it be, opportunities for expanded open space, but it's also really important for groundwater recharge, and getting water underground in LA. I'm really excited with what's happening in greater LA on water sustainability. What's remarkable, I always tell my friends up here in Northern California that, Southern Californians are more water efficient than Northern Californians. And there's been remarkable work in really the last 30, 40 years on improving efficiency and conservation, but then also diversifying water supplies. The challenge LA has with water is historically it's relied on faraway imports of water, right? From the Colorado River Basin or the Owens River Valley or the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. And, for good reason, because, the LA is a part of the state that's really, really arid on the natural. But what's really exciting in greater LA is there's a big movement to reduce reliance on these imports of water. And God, for good reason, because climate change, is driving a 20-year drought in the Colorado River Basin. It's meant, drastic reductions in Sacramento San Joaquin water. So part of the answer is water recycling. Part of the answer is stormwater capture, which is in part what the Sepulveda Basin is, where, you take your water that's either, storm flows or that's not being used, and then allow it to drain into the aquifer. And I know in the San Fernando Valley, parts of the San Fernando Valley, you have to actually treat the water because of some contamination, but the pump and treat approach is, seems to be working. So long-winded way of answering your question is, yeah, Sepulveda Basin is the kind of big transformational project that we want to support at the state. Whether it counts, whether that 2,000 acres counts into 30 by 30, I'd have to look at that and understand, because again, we have this part of our, baseline or guidelines or standards for 30 by 30 is there has to be sort of an environmental conservation benefit. And I would say if it does, great. If it doesn't, great, because there's all sorts of climate resilience funding that we're funding across the state. Some of it is 30 by 30. Some of it is related to water resilience. So I think the best way, if you want to advance a big vision on Sepulveda Basin, is to engage us, which it sounds like you're doing, bring your electeds together, and to really identify, okay, what's the big vision? And typically, big project like that would never have like one source of funding. You'd have to cobble together funding from the feds, from the state, maybe from local sources, et cetera. But the idea would be really being able to sell the vision and explain how transformational it could be, both on water and, for environmental reasons. So we want to be supportive of that. Challenge in the state is we have a lot of siloed, compartmentalized sources of funding. But one thing I'm trying to do is really break that down and say, look, we need to do these big transformational projects, including the 30 by 30. How do we utilize all these separate pots of funding to get those projects done? So, you'd have my engagement and my team's engagement along with hopefully your local leaders around how to get a big transformational project like that done.
Okay, well, we're working on that, and it's nice to know that if it doesn't fit in that one particular project, the other projects that you mentioned, which there are quite a few of, might be supportive. So,
totally.
So what we're going to do is we're going to open the chat so that everybody can start putting questions for the secretary in the chat, and Michelle's got one question to finish out our conversation.
Yes, so the final question, are there opportunities for public and private partnerships to support the 30 by 30? And then how do we know where those funding grants and opportunities are?
It's a great question. So yes, one of the things that, little spoiler alert on the final report of 30 by 30 is we'll likely be proposing essentially like an ongoing hub of collaboration. I think we're going to, the working title is the 30 by 30 partnership, where we're bringing together an inclusive set of partners across the state, every couple of months with working groups in different areas. Part of that partnership is going to be essentially like an online one-stop shop for opportunities, funding opportunities, policy opportunities, et cetera. So if we play our cards right, or we do this right with with our strategy, we're going to be launching this inclusive partnership where entities like yours, across the state that say, look, I think this could be a big, good vehicle for things that we want to do. How do we get engaged? How do we find funding? What are the opportunities, et cetera? Then you guys, whoever wants to can participate in this 30 by 30 partnership. So I'm really excited about that. And then I think you guys need to just give us, candid feedback. Sometimes in state government, we kind of have our nose to the grindstone and we're kind of talking to ourselves here in Sacramento. So help us understand, once we put out this final strategy and stand up that partnership, what's working and what's not working. And is it an effective hub that you can plug into, or is it not? So I'm looking forward to that and looking forward to your frank feedback.
Sounds
excellent.
Great.
Thank you.
And thank you, and thanks, Michelle. All right, Kathy, you're going to help us collect some questions. Do you want to share one of the questions in the chat?
Sure. I have one from Margaret, who wants to know what is the possibility of planting 1 million trees along the California freeway system as a nature-based solution?
Well, planting trees is absolutely a nature-based solution, particularly in communities without enough of them. You may have seen that National Geographic article last year that identifies inequities in tree cover in greater Los Angeles. It's an amazing, they had like a 3-page fold-out map that shows that some communities in our state have very little tree cover, while other communities have really impressive tree color. And not surprisingly, one defining factor is affluence of whether a community has tree cover. Tree cover is important for a bunch of different reasons, including, obviously reducing heat, given the extreme heat driven by climate change. But there's also obviously a lot of other benefits, which is, revegetating our cities obviously absorbs carbon, but then also allows for more permeable pavement that brings water into underground basins, et cetera, et cetera. So we have been spending tens of millions of dollars every year on greening our neighborhoods, and Luz Rivas is a big champion of this. I think one thing I take from the question that got asked is, like 1 million tree strategy or some sort of target, I think is interesting. I think it's a good suggestion around really trying to galvanize and drive our progress. I'm a big believer in targets because I think they move leaders and governments. So like the idea of an urban greening target, and I would acknowledge that it's a major priority for us right now.
Great. I just wanted to we had Melanie Winter do a short presentation on the Sepulveda Basin for those who had not seen it prior to you coming on the call. And just wanted to see if Melanie she put the executive summary into the chat, so anybody is welcome to look at that. And if there was a specific question, Melanie, that you wanted to ask the secretary.
Sure, thanks. I believe I saw some early draft of some of the GIS work that was coming out of 30 by 30. And what struck me was the lack of our waterways. So our waterways were not included as potential habitat corridors. And our river and tributaries are absolutely critical habitat biodiversity corridors, as well as wetlands and opportunities to recharge groundwater and manage stormwater and clean up stormwater and on and that. I understand that our current situation is that they are channelized, but they are still waterways that are supposed to be under public trust and could serve as habitat corridors. So it would be terrific to see our network of tributaries and waterways in the 30 by 30 GIS.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I should mention that sometimes I talk about conserving land as a shorthand for 30 by 30, but for what it's worth, our target, and it's worth a lot, I think, our target includes conserving 30% of both our lands and our coastal waters. California government controls between the mean high tide line, so essentially the beach, and 3 miles out into the ocean. And right now, about 16% of our coastal waters are protected through our Marine Protected Area Network, or MPA network. And so obviously we're focused on reaching 30% there. But we've also gotten a lot of good feedback around, well, but how about freshwater, our rivers, our waterways, our wetlands? I think wetlands would be included in the 30 by 30. We're struggling with rivers because we were trying to figure out, well, how would you talk about 30% of rivers? And rivers are actually part of these landscapes. I mean, really watersheds. But we do take that feedback. And so I think in the final draft, we're going to talk about conserving aquatic habitats, because we know that, some of the most challenging biodiversity stressors or threats to biodiversity are in our aquatic systems. Mm-hmm. And then you're bringing up, I think, a totally, even something beyond that, which is, there are a lot of natural waterways that have either been channelized or subverted underground. And there exists immense opportunities to, where possible, to, restore the ecological function of those historic waterways. And so I'm not familiar right now with how our GIS platform, Cal Nature, addresses those, but I think it's really good feedback. I mean, we are working with folks on both the LA River and the San Gabriel River around how do you restore as much ecological function as possible, in these historic waterways. We have to solve for our disconnect from nature and removing the natural function of those systems. So yeah, I'll take your point back to our team.
Thank you. I'm really excited for you to see the Sepulveda Basin study, which does just that. And I'll just note that wetland and riparian habitats sequester carbon more effectively than most other habitats do. So they are super critical. The restoration of those particular ecosystems are super critical to meet our goals.
Totally agree.
Thank you. Thanks, Melanie. Michelle, do you have a question?
Yeah, the question comes from Joanne. She said that she's a bird watcher, and she was wondering if California and other countries with the 30 by 30 plan are partnering for migration routes, and are any Central American or South American countries involved with the 30 by 30?
Boy, that's a really good question. in California, one thing we're prioritizing is trying to restore our wetlands. Sadly, 95% of our wetlands in our Great Central Valley have been demolished, and those wetlands have historically been really important to the Pacific Flyway, which is, of course, what I'm told is the largest migration of life on Earth every year, the birds moving from far north to far south in the Southern Hemisphere. And so we have a major challenge because we've essentially, destroyed, most of the habitat for that Pacific Flyway. So we are really focused on restoring habitat for the birds, basically, and not just migrating birds, obviously, but that's been a big focus. But I would say, we have not connected with Central American countries or Mexico or others on the Pacific Flyway. I think that's an area of real potential to identify what they're doing. And I'm just getting involved in this sort of the international coalition on 30 by 30. So I'm not even sure which, if any, Central American countries are participating.
Thank you. Kathy, do you have a question?
Sorry, it was muted. Cindy would like to know about the inclusion of working lands in the 30 by 30 plan. For example, can an almond orchard using composting and cover cropping be considered as conserved land?
Really good question. So in California, we talk about, natural and working lands. Natural lands being, your wilderness area or your, regional park in some cases, and then working lands being sort of your ranches, your commercial forests, your farms. And it's interesting, a tribal colleague of mine said, he called me out on a big Zoom presentation. He said, Wade, your distinction between natural and working lands is not something we identify with as tribal people. For us, all lands are natural and have been working since the beginning of time, and people have been at the center of them. So I just share that because it's a fair point. But as it relates to working lands on farms and ranches, the answer is yes. Some of those working lands can be considered to be conserved areas, but they do have to abide certain environmental practices. So those that you mentioned, for example, composting, cover crops, etc., could be eligible for 30 by 30. People that I work with that are smarter than me in defining that conservation definition would really have a more fine-grained answer to that. But yes, absolutely. Working lands, including ranch lands that have cattle grazing, if they have certain environmental practices, will be included in 30 by 30.
And we have on the call the co-chair from the Los Angeles chapter of Climate Reality, and he has a question about drought. Andy?
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. I do have a quick question. So we were told as a chapter that water conservation is the most impactful action that we can take as individual members. I wanted to know if you agree, or if you think it's more important to support the nature-based solutions that you're talking about and others are talking about, as well as water infrastructure. I'd really like to just get another perspective and see what we can do as members to really mitigate and solve the drought crisis and ensure that we have access to water and that everyone has access.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think it's an and, not an or. I think we can all, every Californian should make every effort to conserve water. And I think, though, we're headed into this new normal of climate change. And so we talk a lot at the state around, we're not going to respond to drought. We're now managing drought. In other words, it's not emergency response, it's emergency management. These are conditions that we might, get a wet year here and there, but that are here to stay. So I'm really, when I talk to people and they say, what can I do? It's like, yes, use less water, but better yet, really change out. If you, have a yard, for example, change out that ornamental turf where the only time anyone ever walks on it is to mow it. You don't have a lot of that in LA, but believe it or not, they have a lot of it in Sacramento. Change to, drought tolerant plants, where possible, change out appliances to be more water saving. So there is that, making what we call making water conservation a way of life. But I would say for, leaders like you and your chapter, that's not sufficient. Yeah, I would say also really drive your local water agencies and regional water agencies to identify and pursue a pathway to greater sustainability. And by greater sustainability, we need to be maximizing not only conservation and efficiency, but water recycling and stormwater capture. And using that importation of water really as kind of the last slice of the pie to address water, to meet water supply. So from my perspective, sophisticated advocates really have a role to play, asking their local leaders and frankly, hold us accountable at the state around what are you doing to ensure that our system is resilient. It can't just be, when a drought hits, tell everybody to reduce their water by 20%. Yes, that's part of it, but that's not the whole answer. So it's it's both conservation and efficiency and driving your communities towards broader, more sustained water resilience.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Diana.
Of course. Michelle, do you have another question? And I see we're getting close to time. We don't want to keep you past 8:30, but maybe we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Sure. Yep. How does the newest IPCC report affect how you and the California government are thinking about 30 by 30, as well as the 3 priorities that you shared with us?
Well, look, we got to move further faster than we're doing right now. The IPCC report, which of course is this body of international scientists, rigorous peer review, provided, some pretty grim understanding that we have a, closing window of opportunity to avoid the, worst, most catastrophic climate impacts on this planet. And so that's a cause for really, we've had a lot of internal conversations, and actually including Gavin Newsom, kind of driven by Gavin Newsom. That's like, yes, we can feel good about what's happening in California, but the world is destabilizing more quickly than we're transitioning. So we're having a big, think in our administration around, how we can accelerate targets and projects to actually demonstrate for the world, the transition to carbon neutrality, and then protect people and nature from the impact. So I think one is it's like, driving acceleration, which is challenging because we feel like we're moving really fast. And, there are certain implications of moving fast, including, everything from electricity rates to, and all manner of unintended consequences, but we feel like we need to move quicker. I will say though, that there's a lot of hope in that IPCC report too. And one of the areas is really calling out nature and the resilience of nature. It's amazing. I was driving into the Delta, not far from here, the Sacramento San Joaquin Bay Delta. And I was going to check on the progress of a huge habitat restoration project. And I was driving down this levee, and I swear that there were like 5,000 Alaskan snow geese that lit up after this field at once. And they call it a fly off up here. And it was magical. I put it on Twitter. If anybody wants to, everyone does Twitter, and you go to Wade Crowfoot at Twitter, you can see this incredible 15-second video. I almost drove off the road actually. But I mean, so to me, it's like nature is incredibly resilient, and these nature-based solutions are a solution that's been under our nose. And to me, everybody else, probably like you, I get distraught with all of these, this news on climate change. But to me, I take my lead from the scientist Katherine Hayhoe. If you haven't read her book, you should. And she talks about we maintain hope by taking action, and as we take action, we build others' hope. And that's my thing. It's like I'm scared to death. I have a 7-year-old. I'm worried about the future of our planet, the livability of humans on this planet. But I think there's no other opportunity than to dig in and go further and faster. So I'm really appreciative that you guys take your time out at the end of a long day to be part of an organization trying to make change in your community and the world. And I can tell you a lot of people in Sacramento that are working to do the same thing.
I think this is a great place to sort of end the evening. That was very inspirational. And, I just want to end with one final question. Is there anything, having heard our questions, our interests, we're down here in the LA area, is there anything that you would suggest we can do that would give us the greatest impact in what is a very urgent situation as you've described?
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, keep doing what you're doing. I mean, organizing around climate is absolutely necessary, and driving accountability for people in the state, your local electeds, your state electeds, absolutely important. But then also, you know, doing these projects like the Sepulveda Basin that are demonstrating climate action. We need climate action at scale, but it's not like, you know, you tell leaders in Sacramento to take climate action and then we just write something and take the climate action. It all happens on the ground. It all happens on the ground, whether that's rooftop solar, renewable energy efficiency, decarbonization, nature-based solutions. It happens on the ground. So to me, you guys are, you know, you have the huge outsized cultural influence on the rest of the world because you're part of LA, and everyone's looking to LA. I mean, just by virtue of its cultural importance. So the work that you do in your community, in your region, taking climate action and building climate resilience, not only benefits your communities, but has outsized impacts. It has impacts up here because, you know, LA dominates the dialogue up here, given its population size, but also across the world. So just know that the work that you're doing on these projects matters well beyond the places where you live.
Good to know. Very good to know. Well, Secretary Crowfoot, it is such an honor to have had you tonight for this time, to have this conversation. We really appreciate it. We look forward to staying in touch with you as we move forward, and we would like to participate in the 30 by 30 plan in whatever way we can. So please feel free to reach out to us and let us know how we can support your work.
Thank you so much. And I'll tell your legislators who are up here, if they're around tonight, that I had an opportunity to visit with you all. Thank you for the work that you do. It's really, I mean, it's inspirational. That's where I draw my energy. So thanks, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great. Well, that was just such a great conversation. It sounded like everybody really enjoyed the speaker. Yes? Was that amazing? That's just great. Okay. Thank you all for joining. We really appreciate it. There were some new folks, and it was really nice to have you on the call. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Appreciate it. Take good
Wonderful
care.
meeting. Thanks,
It was
Diana.
amazing.
Yeah.
Very
Thank
heartfelt.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.